Speaker number 5 is Dr. Horace Alexander, and his title, Writing Historical Fiction. Please welcome Dr. Horace Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Toastmaster. My novel is Moon Over Port Royal. It's a historical novel. I'm a member of the Historical Novel Society of Southern California, and they define a historical novel as any novel that is written with a time setting that's 50 years removed from the time when the writing was being done. So if I were to write a novel anytime between 1974 and prior to that date, then that would qualify as a historical novel. Now, just for a little bit of background, I'd like to share.
During the 17th century, this area was known as the Spanish Main. England and Spain sought to establish dominance and exploit the region for its resources. King Charles II, after whom our current King Charles III was named, gave permission to anyone to plunder the Spanish treasure ships and made sure to get his share of the plunder. Jamaica was a prime generator of revenue for the British Crown through piracy and the cultivation of the sugarcane with slave labor. Port Royal became the pirate capital where the pirates celebrated their raids with lavish spending and riotous living. 1 in every 4 buildings on Port Royal was either a tavern or a brothel or both. The peninsula became quite crowded with 2,000 structures on a mere 51 acres of land. It was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, except perhaps for Boston in what was then the American colonies. Meanwhile, up in the hills, the Maroon freedom fighters successfully waged guerrilla warfare against the English. Then in 1692, Port Royal was struck with a massive earthquake that devastated the peninsula. And a tsunami scoured the landscape, sweeping everything in its path under the ocean, where for the most part they remain to this day. Today, Port Royal is a declared UNESCO heritage site, one of the most important marine archaeological sites in the world. As a young boy in elementary school, we went on a field trip to what remained of Port Royal. This is a view of Fort Charles, one of 6 forts that guarded Port Royal in its heyday. As a child, along with my classmates, we walked through this giddy house. We called it the giddy house because of the slanting of the floor inside made you lose your balance quite often in trying to get from one end to the other. So we called it the giddy house. That was one of the most important and most remarkable memories that I have of my childhood in elementary school.
Now, when I became an adult, I happened to have read a report on the great earthquake of 1692. But it was rather dry and journalistic, the who, when, where, why, and how of the event. I found that very uninspiring, considering the many sensory impressions I had as a young child about the swashbuckling pirates and all the shenanigans they undertook in Port Royal and everything else. And so I decided to write a description that I thought was more fitting to the time. And I wrote a description of the earthquake involving all the senses, sight and sound and smell and taste and everything else. Then I said, this is not too bad. And then I experienced what what I would describe as an expansion of my horizon of interest. Because then I would say to myself, who were these people? What kind of lives did they lead? What kind of challenges did they face? And then I began to ask myself, okay, so there was piracy in Port Royal, but what was happening in the 17th century on other parts of Jamaica? And it so happened that there was slavery on the plantations and the freedom fighters in the hills, and they were all three major settings in the 17th century. And so I invented a character called Kwaku, who would link all these together. Kwaku was a small farmer who cultivated his crops and used his donkey called Calypso to go from house to house in Port Royal, including the brothels, and to also go to the plantations and the great houses where the sugarcane plantations were. And he, by circulating in these settings, he was able to gather information for the Maroons. He was actually a spy for the Maroons. And so I researched thoroughly the entire area of Jamaica and Port Royal in particular, and the Maroons up in the hills. And there were some historical characters that I used in my novel, and others I invented totally fictionalized, but which were typical of the time. And some of the highlights of my novel include a hurricane used as an opportunity for slaves to escape to the hills. And then this bookkeeper disguised as a small farmer to spy against the British. And then the guerrilla war in which the Maroons overcame the mighty British army. Then a masquerade ball with lots of revelry and debauchery. And an exciting court scene when the most notorious prostitute in Port Royal was a key witness. And of course, finally, there was a 1692 earthquake that sank 2/3 of the city under the waves of the Caribbean Sea, where it still is today. The Jamaica Beach Patrol constantly monitors the area to preserve and to protect the treasures that are underwater, and which will one day be hopefully made available to the public in the form of an underwater museum, as well as an underwater restaurant and other kinds of developments. But that was how my novel came to be, inspired by an early childhood experience. Back to you, Madame Toastmaster.